Okay, over to our next story. Google is facing the wrath of the European Commission yet again. A fine of $2.7 billion has been imposed by the European regulators for promoting its shopping service at the top of the search results. Let's tell you a little bit more about the specifics of this case. Now, the European regulators have accused Google of placing sponsored ads right at the top of search results. The regulators feel that this prominent placement influences buying decisions and is unfair to other companies selling products on the web. Now, this is the largest penalty to date imposed by the European Commission. Google may choose to appeal against the decision. Now, the investigations into this case began back in 2010 after several companies, including Microsoft, lodged a complaint with the regulator. The $2.7 billion fine makes up for 10% of the annual revenue of Alphabet, Google's parent company. All right, joining us on the broadcast is the ORF's cybersecurity expert from Hyderabad. Arun Kumar is with us on the broadcast. Good evening, Arun. Thanks for joining us. What exactly do you make of the verdict? Do you think it's been fair, or do you think Google's been given a raw deal of sorts?
Well, I think there is a certain degree of politics involved. The European Union regulators, whether it is on antitrust or on privacy, has generally shown a tendency to go after these big American companies. So I do feel that some of it is transatlantic politics playing out. But what is remarkable in this case is that the European Union antitrust regulator has shown a persistence of, following this case for nearly 6 years and finally marshalling the facts to rack up this fine. So it indicates that the European Union is willing to haul these big companies over the coal in defense of what they believe are the interests of the smaller retailers, the e-tailers, so to say, and the smaller companies in Europe's digital economy. So I do believe that perhaps there may have been a bit of politicking involved, and Google may have gotten a shot under the stick. But Google is by no means the only company to have received this sort of fine. Intel, I think a couple of years ago, was fined $1 billion. So these fines are huge for companies. Even if the bottom lines of these companies are big, the fines are by no means insignificant. And what the European Union regulator has done in this case is to clearly say that if you want to do business in the continent, you have to play by our rules for the digital economy.
All right, but Arun, if you can give us an idea of who exactly these complainants were, and do you think it's important for our viewers to understand the nature of the business of these complainants to understand the larger context of what's happened?
Yes, I don't quite remember the exact name, but it is a collective based in the European Union that represents small e-commerce companies across the 27 countries of the European Union. And what they have done is forward a complaint, after which the European Union regulator has basically taken cognizance of the complaint and proceeded on its own merits to investigate and now impose this fine. I think it's a matter of great significance for Indian companies, because you are seeing definite expansion in India's digital economy. You are seeing a growth in the number of companies that are doing e-commerce, but at the same time, the stability of many of these companies is still in doubt. So we have the big players in India like Flipkart or Myntra or Jabang, but we don't know whether, in the long run, whether these companies will be able to sustain their competitiveness with the Amazons and the Googles of the world, or whether new entrants in India will come up that can pose a challenge. What the European Union regulator has done is to ensure, at least on paper, that there is a level playing field for companies that not only exist currently, the smaller countries, the smaller companies within the European Union, but also leave open the prospect of new companies that may be able to compete with the innovations that are offered by Google or Amazon.
Right. You spoke a little while earlier of the financial hit that it's going to have on Google. But what about in terms of image? I mean, Google's always been considered fairly above board in its practices. Do you think that it's going to have a negative impact on the brand value of Google and Alphabet?
Honestly, no. I think what Google has been alleged to do in this case is abuse its dominant position. And if you remember, these the genesis of antitrust claims against internet companies goes back all the way to, I mean, the major ones, goes back all the way to the cases against Microsoft, both in the United States and in Europe. And there is a tendency among Silicon Valley companies to confront regulations head on. Whether you see it with Uber in India, for instance, or with Google in Europe, or Microsoft in the United States, they take it as a sort of a badge of honor to, I mean, I'm generalizing, but they generally take it as a badge of honor to confront regulators in what they believe are, righteous ways of proceeding. For instance, in the aftermath of this antitrust fine, Google has come out with an elaborate explanation saying what they are doing through Google Search and Google Shopping is making shopping convenient for users who may not have the time to go through all the options that they have in store. So they have a very, some would say, brazen approach to the matter, and I don't think their brand is going to be affected because these companies really hold the keys to the internet in that sense.
All right, I'm using Google even as we speak, but let's move on. Arun, if you'll stay with us, I just want to give our viewers an idea of how Google has been on the radar of the European Commission for quite some time now, as Arun was mentioning a little while earlier. Two of its other offerings, the Android operating system and AdSense, are under scrutiny of regulators on similar charges. Now, it's alleged that Google used its market dominance to reduce competition and cut choices for the consumer. We're going to try and get you a couple more details on that. But Arun, does this go beyond just unfair practices and more toward an overhaul of online business practices, not just in Europe? You mentioned India, but really speaking a lesson perhaps for a lot of up-and-coming digital economies.
Oh, absolutely. I think it cuts to the heart of the matter, which is who is designing technology and where is it being designed? And in most of these cases, the technology is being designed in places like Silicon Valley. And we are not really sure whether these technologies are designed keeping emerging markets in mind. So what the European Union antitrust fine is all about is whether Google Shopping takes away the right of smaller e-commerce companies to display their products, which is basically their main source of revenue, and whether Google undercuts that small business that they have. This is because Google is in possession of great amounts of data and has come up with an algorithm that can, in a very sophisticated way, sift through this data and provide the consumer with more information and analysis than is possible by an Indian company or a small European company, which does not have this sort of collection of data. If you look at Uber with regard to its search pricing process, not just in India where it has come under controversy, but also in other parts of the world,
right.
We don't really know what is the algorithm that is sort of driving these dynamic pricing or search pricing, as they call it. We just know that when there is a shortage of drivers in the area, the prices go up. We don't really know what the algorithms are that really get us to this high price. So technology is being designed in a rather opaque way. And I think the European Union outcome that we're talking about is basically a pushback against the fact that designing of technology is happening in one jurisdiction, but its biggest consumers are today outside of the United States.
Okay, you've given me the perfect segue for my next question. Do you think that this is going to prompt a regulation of algorithms in the future?
Well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but I think there is for instance, in India, there is a great deal of push by foreign companies who are important players in, say, government schemes like Digital India. So it's very difficult for the government. If I were a public policy official, if I were a regulator, I would think twice about asking a big internet company to reveal their algorithms or to design their algorithms in a particular way, because right now we don't have any bargaining power. All we know is that the digital economy in India is expanding. The number of internet users per month in India is increasing by many millions. So we do need the American and the Chinese companies to come and do business in India. It may be a while before emerging economies like India or Brazil ask the big companies to or create regulations for their algorithms. It may certainly happen if you see more AI, artificial intelligence-driven applications, because what the algorithm does is of more importance than, say, a search algorithm. Mm-hmm. But for now, this is going to probably be confined to places like the EU.
Okay, but speaking of the end user, the person really speaking that Google has used as defense, the consumer, do you feel that an update to algorithms or a regulation or some sort of check on algorithms will be beneficial to people like you and me who use the internet for online shopping every now and then?
And the question is, what would you regulate the algorithm for? So, in the last couple of years, we have heard about self-driving cars, which rely a little bit on artificial intelligence. So basically, a system that is very sophisticated relies on the collection of data and making intelligent, quote-unquote, assessments about what that data can be used for. When should a self-driving car cross the road? When should it stop? So, one point of regulation for algorithms could be safety. When does an application need to be regulated so that it is safe for consumers to use? I think this is a fairly open and shut case, and you may see governments trying to regulate algorithms on reasons or grounds of safety. But for what else can you regulate for? I don't see Indian governments, Indian regulators trying to haul Google or Amazon over the coals for their preferential search algorithms. I think those days are far away.
All right. So I guess, as you're pointing out, the security feature is of utmost importance. But speaking of, you brought up Uber, you brought up Google, and I can't help but ask you at this point in time that you mentioned that overall the brand value of these entities perhaps will not suffer any sort of damage on account of these reports. But do you think that Indians as consumers are becoming also a lot more aware of global trends and what's going on around them, and that perhaps is something that regulators and service providers really need to keep in mind when they make forays into markets such as these?
Absolutely. I think even with, for instance, not to pick on Uber again and again, but it is constantly in the news, and more often than not, some of its developments are not are not pleasant in terms of what's happening, for instance, with its internal restructuring, the way its CEO had to resign, and so on and so forth. I think brand values do matter at this stage. Unfortunately, as you said, the applications that we have are limited to the major players, whether it is Android, whether it is iOS for Apple users, or whether it is Chinese companies. I mean, we often forget the significant role that Chinese companies have in the Indian digital economy. So these major players have a significant market pull, and more importantly, right now, they're the only players in the market. So for instance, in India's smartphone market, the top 4 of the 5 best-selling smartphones are all Chinese, and the biggest one is Korean. So we don't really have any Indian platforms that can hold a candle to these companies and say, look, we have provided a very good corporate governance model for you to follow, and we are a better brand than you. We just have the TCSs and Infos, which do not compete with the Ubers or the Googles, because they are not app-based companies. So my hunch, I suppose it would change if an Indian consumer was caught in the crosshairs. For instance, with regard to the leak of the confidential medical records of the Uber, in the Uber case where the rider suffered sexual harassment. So unless Indian consumers or Indian users, if their security is compromised, or if their data privacy is compromised, I don't see how the brand value of these companies globally affect us.
All right. Stay with me, Arun. I'm also joined on the broadcast by a former expert consultant with Competition Commission of India, Aviroop Bose. He's on the phone line with us. Aviroop, thanks very much for speaking with us here at WION. Arun and I were just talking about, even though the cases happen in the European Union, the impact when it comes to brands like Google can be felt across the world. How do you see this playing out in the Indian context? Do you think that this is going to have any sort of impact on the way the digital economies in India are progressing, and is it going to call in a great amount of regulation perhaps, or self-regulation by these companies, knowing that a giant such as Google could be caught off guard?
Hi, there obviously, first of all, there is the obvious implication of the fact that Google is obviously simultaneously being scrutinized even in India. and in other developing countries like Brazil. And so therefore, there's an obvious impact on very similar theories of harm as the European Union decision. So there is an obvious impact upon this decision directly on the proceedings that Google will face in India. The other thing which I think, I was just listening to your show, in terms of regulation of algorithms and everything else that you were speaking about, it's very interesting the way the penalty, the penalty is obviously, the fine is about the $2.7 billion. But they have also mentioned that Google has to come up with a way in which it gives equal treatment to competing services. That's the statement of the European Commission. Now, this in some way really will affect the very way in which algorithms work for search engines like Google. So, I mean, it is almost like a de facto regulation of search algorithms, because, for example, Google does exactly the same thing with Google Images, Google Maps. So there could be a multiple amount of such challenges which may be brought about on other services. So, the Commission has obviously not mentioned how Google will go about sort of giving equal treatment. So that fundamentally is something that, because obviously this is huge ad revenue. That's why Google does what it does.
Right.
This will have a huge impact in terms of how their algorithms will be written from now on. Because if this is what the record trend is, the decision is, and they have 90 days to comply. I mean, unless they win an appeal or something, they get an interim stay order or something of that sort, they will have to figure out how to go about with their core search business itself.
Okay, so speaking of that terminology, that statement that you just brought up, do you think also at some level that runs counter to the very concept of competitive business markets? And how exactly does the European Commission plan on ensuring, let's say, that Google and other companies sort of don't toe the line and stick within these regulations? Won't they need updating on a very regular basis, keeping in mind how the internet is growing?
You're absolutely correct, and that's the biggest problem of antitrust authorities across the world. Especially for high-tech cases, the antitrust authorities are actually regulating, for things which has already happened. This is, as you mentioned in your show itself, this is a 2010 complaint which has been going on. So, and Google obviously has filed a reply, and in some ways very interesting. I mean, obviously the authorities have abused, has held that Google has abused its dominant position in the search engine of its shopping service. Now, just ask ourselves, how many of us actually, when we want to buy a book or when we want to buy an equipment, we actually go to Google and type it out. We just go directly to Amazon, Flipkart, OLX, or whatever that service is. So I know I'm perhaps going into to certain legal aspects of the decision, but the decision also is a little bit problematic as to how it finds Google's dominance in that particular area. Because, yes, it has a 95% market in the search engine, but search engine of what? Of what product? So that's very interesting. I'm sure, when Google goes in appeal, it will argue because, Amazon is a very healthy competitor. In India, Flipkart and other sort of, shopping websites are very healthy competitors.
Okay. Thanks, gentlemen. You've left me with more questions than I'd started the broadcast off on. But thanks for detailing all of that for us, especially for our viewers. Both Aviroop as well as Arun, appreciate you joining us here on WION. Hope to see you soon again.